Good morning, Frankfurt, as they say, right? In Rockstar and what other businesses. Great that you made it here. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. We were not sure whether this is a good idea to do it on a Friday because of all your parties yesterday and before yesterday and before that and so on. So great to have you. Thank you so much. We want to have a conversation about one of those topics that is on everybody's minds, I would say, after this week. And we want to give it a little bit of a different spin and really talk to publishers and librarians about their own experiences with research integrity and where they work. We don't want political declarations in this case, how important it is. We know all of that. But we really want to go a little bit deeper. My goal, brief, and assignment is to speak as little as possible, and that's why every of these lady and the gentleman introduces themselves, I thought, talking a little bit about what they do, who they are, and what their companies do, and certainly how they feel about, so what their position to research integrity, publishing integrity, if you want, is. I guess we start with you, Vivian. Thanks for being here, and let's go.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, Sven, and to the Charleston Frankfurt Conference. It's really great to sort of see this initiative joining up as we kind of create this transatlantic conference coordination. So it's lovely to be here, especially because I'll be missing Charleston in a few weeks, which I'm very upset about. So I get to have a little bit of a input of Charleston. So just to introduce myself, I'm Vivian Berghahn, the daughter of Marion Berghahn, our founder. And we are a family firm. We were founded 30 years ago next year, actually, so it's an exciting year ahead. My older brother is also involved. He's our CTO, and I've been in the firm over 20 years, having had previous incarnations at other publishing companies to see how it might work. But obviously then coming into a family firm, an independent family firm, is a very, very different situation and has been an amazing learning experience. And we are a small company. I would say sort of our annual turnover is probably an Elsevier rounding error. So it's a very different sides of the conversation that you'll see. So as a result, because we remain small, we do 125 books a year. We have 40 journals. We're a staff of around 25. We have 2 offices, one in Oxford and one in Brooklyn, New York. So as a result, we're very still close to our authors, and on the journal side as well, our journal editors. So ours is very much a very relational publishing initiative, and so we remain very close, and I think are therefore very close to these issues, and can talk, I think, as a result, very sort of frankly and also candidly, and hear from authors, series editors, journal editors, when these concerns come up, and I think that's in many ways sort of a great privilege of being that sort of size. And I think a lot of the conversations we hear around research integrity always focuses on the challenges of scale and size. And I think that often is part of the problem. And so I think how publishers of all ranges then tackle and talk about these things is an important one. And I think, we've always found that this remains sort of an extension of the ongoing conversations we continue to have, whether it's research integrity or just general precarity within higher education that obviously has a great deal knock-on effects on how we publish and who we publish and how they get to publish. So I think go with that.
Thanks, Vivian. That's a great start, and I guess there's never a rule that you have to do this in a row. So I think it makes perfect sense now to bring you in, Stuart, because you are the other side of the continuum when it comes to size. And you referred to it already, Vivian. So go ahead, please.
Thanks, Sven. So my name's Stuart Whayman. I'm the Managing Director for our solutions that support researchers and librarians at Elsevier. So as Vivian said, I can give a perspective maybe from the journal publishing end of the spectrum as opposed to the book publishing, and different in terms of scale and use in technology. As you know, Elsevier has scale, 2,800 journals, 2.7 million submissions of articles every year. And obviously, that creates some challenges when it comes, and opportunities when it comes to research integrity that we'll be able to explore as we go through that. My role, just to explain a little bit further, as Managing Director for Researchers and Librarians, my role is one step removed from the actual editorial policy and publishing process, which sits and has an independent setting within Elsevier. My responsibility is around the products that support that. So our submission systems and platforms, our dissemination platforms, so products like Science Direct, editorial manager in Aries from a submission platform perspective. So myself and my teams are responsible for developing tools that are involved in this space to support authors, editors, and reviewers. So I think that's probably enough as an introduction.
Super, thanks a lot, Stuart. And now you might think, why is this guy in the middle, who is not a publisher, sitting in the middle? So Peter, tell us a little bit about your background, because I think you will give a special flavor, I hope, to this whole panel.
Hi, I'm Peter Brantley, and I'm the Director of Online Strategy at the University of California Davis Library. And I have quite a diverse background. Some of you may know pieces of it. I've been in various not-for-profit startups in annotation or with the Internet Archive as well. And long career in research libraries, typically heading technology groups. But I also have been very active in publishing and in running publishing conferences as well. So, I think my perspective is a little bit different, but it's also very complementary. At a large research university like the University of California, Davis, we are increasingly, as a library, focused on changing dynamics of research, of how research is done within our campuses, trying to support research computing infrastructure, and very much focused on trying to support the use of data and the ability for researchers to both generate and deposit data in reliable mechanisms. And so the integrity and reliability of the research that they do is of critical importance for us. Not uniquely, my library is creating our own set of applications supporting researcher profiles. So many publishing platforms, services platforms have the equivalent, but we're trying to ensure that we have an authoritative understanding of the publications, the patents, the grants that our faculty are producing. So it's hard enough at a university the size of the University of California to figure out who's even working on our campuses. You would be surprised at the number of title codes that you run into. But we feel like being able to track the types of outputs and collaborations across our faculty is really critical. And that weighs directly in our ability to better understand authoritatively the authenticity of contributions into publishing, into the literature. And I think has been spoken of many times in this, through this conference, through the fair. Research is not just about publications. It's kind of a skein of outputs. It's research data, it's preprints, it's analyses, and a wide range of other inputs that are often encapsulated in a publication and produce a publication of record, but then that may not be the sum end of that research. That research continues. And so, I think a challenge for all of us is keeping track of what's real in that network and ensuring that the authenticity of that represented research is carried forward and made available, and that non-authoritative or non-valid research is not curated for selection and is not elevated, and that there are responsible filters for its removal from the discourse of scholarship and research.
So here's the problem. We have to call off the next panel because there's too much to be discussed, as you can already see. I will be completely subjective on diving into it. Thanks for setting the scene, everybody. And maybe, Stuart, we start with you because you refer to products in Elsevier's portfolio which also serve other publishers, not just Elsevier's content, like Editorial Manager does and others, I guess. So compared to where we were 5 years ago, before the pandemic, what would you say has changed fundamentally and what has changed gradually, if that is a differentiation that makes sense in research integrity? So I think a lot of people are talking about growing volume, but that we know by now, right? That is happening since a number of years. But is there a kind of qualitative change where you would say this is making the problem more prominent and more central to what we do?
So it's a great question. Thanks, Sven. I would say there's a range of issues here, and I think part of the danger here is that we very quickly leap into giving an opinion that there is one big problem to solve here, and actually this is an issue that is it's multifaceted and it has a range of different issues. When we think about research integrity, a lot of the press and some of the challenges and some of the increased challenges come from the rise of things like paper mills and potentially the use of generative AI. But it's not just about that. There are a lot of challenges within the ecosystem that create pressure on researchers that actually create the environment where actually things go wrong with research. And I want to say it in that way, that we assume research integrity is always something where there is perhaps malintent. Of course, there is a range where there is malintent, there's fraud, there are papers which are created, which are either through plagiarism or created and falsified results. But it's not just that, it's also good and bad research practices as well. And the pressure on researchers and the academic community, the pressure to deliver results and the pressure of speed, all of which I think we can recognise, create an environment where sometimes it isn't just about malintent as well, it's about accidents that happen. And I think for all of us who are part of that ecosystem, one of the things I think that has changed most from where I'm sitting is the willingness of people across the spectrum to come together to work to solve those solutions. Not just fighting in our own corners and saying we're the only ones with a particular issue here, but how do we work together to solve some of those issues? And I actually think that's one of the positives that comes out of this, that actually we recognise those challenges and that we work to solve together.
Yeah, thanks. And I think this element of working together as an industry to solve the problem, or an ecosystem, and not just looking at publishers, is, I guess, one of the reasons why we need Peter necessarily on this panel to really understand what the other parts of the ecosystem are contributing. But before we go there, Vivian, one question to you. There's sometimes this feeling in the conversation, I would say, that research integrity and the challenges next to volume have to do with changing business models, with open access and so on. You have been at the forefront for both books and journals in open access. So what's your take on what Stuart described over the last 5 years? Has this changed the landscape, and has this made it more fragile in a certain way? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, I definitely think, I don't think it can be a surprise when you have sort of an acceleration that sort of prioritizes scale, quantity, sort of pay to publish, sort of dynamics that have really exploded over the last few years. And I think open access and APCs really sort of created, I think, a much firmer and more pressure to really not only publish more, but it became a very transactional sort of shift in publishing that I think has been slowly happening, but I think it really has been accelerated by this. And I think this has definitely created broader shifts and the rise in inequality that's talked about. And now, we begin again to talk about equity and the need for more equitable models. But I think these pressures have definitely compounded. And so again, I think it's no surprise that there are reward incentives also at the institutional level that are really driving academics to publish more. Publishing more is tied into funding, right? Department funding, the REF in the UK. I think these are all ingredients that, it's small wonder that we have academics who are feeling the pressure to return publication results at speed. And I think it's the constant also pressure for speed. And I think, you're cutting corners and peer review time frames become ever greater to do it more quickly. And I think, it can be really no surprise that we end up here and find academics under pressure to really cut corners, or just out of error or lack of education. We sort of half joke we're still trying to teach academics about permissions and copyrights, so I think when we start to talk about these other areas, a lot of it is about, I think, ongoing education and needing to keep up with those areas.
Yeah, and Peter, to this point, the role of institutions, libraries, particularly research institutes, universities in the setting. What I did as a preparation for this panel was looking up library schools around the world and how many of them teach research and publishing integrity. And there is very little of that. So it seems to be an issue that is kind of deposited with publishers. You solve it. I would assume that in these processes that you described earlier, publication and research support processes, the library clearly has a role, the institution has a role. How do you see that?
Well, first I would say looking at library schools and trying to figure out whether or not there's representative reference to publishing or research integrity is akin to looking at the whole gamut of publishing as an industry and trying to figure out if research integrity is well represented there too. The breadth of what a library is incredibly wide, both in the United States as well as internationally, of course. And our understanding of what a library is and does, even within the higher educational environment, changes quite a bit. But I think, I guess a couple of points to raise from what my colleagues have observed. And there are some disciplines where sort of the impulse to speed or impulse to productivity that OA and transformative agreements might have engendered has actually been part of their disciplines for a really long time. Some disciplines just move in different manners than other disciplines. So if you're working in physics for a long time, you have been working within a framework where preprints is, if not the authoritative version, the working version, and the publication of record is essentially an afterthought in many ways. But in other disciplines, in a more traditional publishing process, and the timelines required to go through traditional peer review and editorial and production and publishing is more sort of part of the course. So I think that the culture within academia, within academic research itself is incredibly diverse. And so, when we try to talk about research integrity and reliability and reproducibility, we're working with a very wide range of cultures. So I think you have to look within each culture to understand what the ramifications are for our better understanding and better support of reliability and integrity. And that's the kind of more complex understanding that a research library has to be able to provide within the context of the campus research community. I also wanted to note your comment about sort of almost, let me paraphrase, mistakes can happen, and maybe not every researcher has the intent to generate poorly thought out scholarship. And I think we all recognize the elephant in the room of artificial intelligence and specifically generative AI and its role in a very dark side of being able to produce a large swath of content that might not be considered appropriate and should be filtered out. But it's also the case that increasingly we're going to be working with a wider array of research productivity tools in generative AI models, or one of those. And there's a very, very legitimate purpose and role for scholars to be working with Gen AI. And I think one of the challenges that we're all struggling with up and down the publishing pipeline is to better understand what the contributions of those tools are. Is it just a piece of software like Photoshop or InDesign, or is the generative aspect of AI actually more contributory? And I think many of us, and this is where libraries have a voice in partnership with publishers, we're interested in generating new ways of referencing or providing for citation management or notice of how AI and other newer technologies are contributing to the research process. And that has to be documented and regularized so that, from contribution to publication, that those contributions can be noted. AI is not an evil thing. AI can be a very useful product, and our ability to understand how our ability to produce new forms of science, new forms of breakthroughs and insights, and how to document those have to follow along with our ability to provide publishing support and research support for them.
I want to go one step back before we go further into AI, and I think that's probably the last wave of technology, which is 15 years old or so. To use, Stuart, the question, looking at systems and standards in peer review, when you look at different providers, different product types, conferences, whatever it is, there seems to be no real standardization, but there seems to be a definition by a journal board, by a publisher. This is how we do peer review. At the same time, the result of that is a pretty absolute statement. This is great quality, right? That's what we are all saying. And even if the impact factor of a journal is lower than the other one, we don't say this is crap. We just say it's a different focus and whatever. So how do you see that evolve? Can we bring peer review as an overall system to those standards that the industry, the ecosystem needs for trust and credibility without standardizing these kinds of things?
You're asking me?
No. Good.
Yeah, so another great question. I would start by saying I think there's a you mentioned a couple of things. One is quality, and the other is trust and research integrity. And to me, they're two slightly different things. The measure of quality is something that different publishers will have different journals which market based on the impact of the research. But whatever the quality of the research, whatever the quality of the journal, across the whole industry, there has to be a baseline of integrity that is no different. It needs to be no different from one publisher to the next publisher. That's something that has to be common. And that's why I see this as something that we should be collaborating on as an industry, and isn't something where we should fragment. On quality, of course, we're going to have our own special sauce with our editorial teams to drive that. But actually, when it comes to eradicating things that undermine the scholarly record, that to me is an ecosystem problem. It's not a single publisher problem, it's not a librarian problem, it's an ecosystem problem. And so one of the things that we're doing as publishers is coming together as an industry through the STM Association and pooling a lot of our expertise in this particular area. So we're sharing data, insights, and technology to actually develop common tools that can be used and plugged into by publishers across the industry. So there's a working group there's a group called the STM Integrity Hub, and it involves over 30 different publishers. There's over 70 different people in the working groups associated with that. And that team is working on tools that identify things that are common and that we can legally share between publishers to actually eliminate some of those pieces. Of course, there are some things which are going to be individual choice of individual publishers. And going back to your original question, at Elsevier, we do have Editorial Manager as a tool, as a submission system through Aries that actually a number of publishers in the industry supply. Through that, our view is to allow plugins to whatever the customers want to do. We want to be agnostic from that perspective. I think the place to drive that is through a neutral place like the association.
I think that's very helpful on the technology side. Vivian, since you're representing a publisher that does both in a significant portion within the company, books and journals, in the humanities and social sciences, it always feels to me, that's probably my knowledge unlatched background, I don't know, but it always feels to me that this is a little bit different than botany or immunology or whatever. What's your feel in the humanities and social sciences across these different product types? What do we need to do to keep this corpus of research integrity together and not have it like fall apart into different buckets?
I mean, I think what comes to mind is sort of the conversations that were had over the last few years, but have also been vital conversations around, integrity. But ultimately, I think about peer review and important questions about who is the peer and what does peer review mean. And I think when we talk about integrity, I think you need to also talk about and think about bias and problems around inclusion and diversity that I think have come up and been very important conversations in the last few years. And so I think I'm a little weary about a lot of the tools and the technology that's a kind of a technocratic solution for what remains sort of quite socioeconomic, but ultimately also behavioral standards and issues in higher education. And I think a lot of the gatekeeping and conversations about citation practices and ultimately peer review. Who can peer review? Who gets to peer review? How? And what determines a good paper? Based on who's cited and whether you're citing sort of foundational figures and who are those foundational figures? How do scholars on the margins get sort of brought back into the center? So I think these are sorts of questions that need to be had alongside conversations around integrity and research and standards. So I think for me, I think it's really important that peer review has standards and obviously the end result needs to be agreed on, but how we get there has to be tailored and defined, I think, to the discipline, but with an ultimate kind of attention to these wider problems that can impact botany as much as they can impact anthropology. So
yeah, thanks. And to the audience, please get your questions ready. We are almost there. But I have a provocative question or a statement for you, Peter. One could say that the industry, with what Stuart said in Research Integrity Hub and so on, is a little bit reactive in responding to challenges, right? So obviously the issue came up over a longer period of time. Obviously one could have been more proactive as an industry about the core element of what we are about, of the value creation, if you want, of publishers. But talking about startups like Morris here and others in this field, how do you see the role in kicking us a little bit further with just technology, with no content interest, if you want, in that respect? And to your point about AI, I think that's probably a culmination point where we now see that things are changing. So do you think this will be having a transformative impact on research integrity and how we look at it?
I guess I would push a little bit against the assumption that the kinds of initiatives that Stuart referenced are reactive, because I think they're actually very proactive. And I think both in humanities, certainly in STM, we are seeing and we are acknowledging a rather profound shift in how we produce research outputs from more traditional publishing models to a services model. I think we're all trying to figure out a wider range of ways of engaging with the research enterprise. I think being able to provide greater inclusivity, to provide greater access for a wider range of scholars to engage with us is definitely part of that and should be part of that. And if there's a pushback, it's just that we need to do more to provide those kinds of opportunities, openings, and sort of inputs for people to be able to participate in that. But I think it's really critical for us to be able to produce and to collaborate on the kind of federated or communal types of support for services, for standards that relate to researcher identification, output identification, the various kinds of glue that allow us all to work together as publishers, as libraries, as research support specialists. This is, I think, a very different kind of publishing environment than we were working in even 10 years ago. And, generative AI is an important contribution, I think, to our understanding of the evolving landscape for how we need to do publishing and how we need to do research. But it is just one component of a larger transformation in how we spread information and knowledge, both within our knowledge domains, but also with how we share it with the public, how we engage in communication of science with public, and how we advocate for awareness in policy development and policy formation for critical elements that are important for our societies and globally for our planet.
Vivian, a question to you as a relatively small publisher compared to Elsevier. How do you tackle this challenge of AI? Because you will be exposed to it as well. You will probably not have the resources to say, let's take 200 people who can work on this for the next 2 years and then see how we take it from there. So what do you do about it? And how do your journal boards, your book series boards respond to this? Because when I talk to academics, they are all like, in my classes, all students are now working with AI tools to write their papers and so on. I'm not sure whether that's actually true, but at least there is this anxiety. So how do you respond to that as a relatively small company?
I mean, I think it's a challenge. I think in many ways technology has been a great leveler, like playing field leveler, I feel. It's helped us a lot. I think ebooks, for instance, really helped us get out there. Open access has allowed us scale and exposure and readership in a way that a small publisher can't otherwise achieve, because we don't have the staff, we don't have the access and the resources. So I think it's a real challenge. I mean, there are also, I think this is why we've worked a lot with open source software, and I think for us, we're lucky enough that my brother has a tech background, and I know a lot of companies of our size don't have that. So I think on the one hand, it's seeing what tools are out there that work for a publisher of our size, that we can afford, that our journals can afford. But when we've had the conversations around AI and sort of research integrity, a lot of it then goes back to, again, is it a technology problem? I think there are tools that can solve things well, like, even as basic as spell check. But, now if they can use AI to create citations and very things that don't have to be edited for, that's great. But, I think these are the conversations, again, around author and journal editor relations to their authors and to their contributors, and just ultimately, if you have to update your guidelines, and if your author is going to lie about AI as much as they would lie about whether or not this is actually their own article and they haven't plagiarized it in any way, I think it's an extension of the same problem, and again, goes back to a relationship and about the importance of relational publishing, not transactional publishing. So, yeah.
And to that end, Stuart, a question to you. In this great transformation into an article-based economy, where our business models are changing, where our cost structures in publishing are changing as well, and revenue structures, of course, do you see that there will be more of an investment need in research integrity and peer review? I was looking at a few cases where I saw publishers basically quote between 15 and 20% of their revenues they are investing into peer review related systems, personnel, staff, and so on. Do you think this will go up over time, or do you think this is a pretty healthy situation for publishers to be at?
So it's definitely true that over the last few years, I think most publishers, if not all publishers, have stepped up their investment around research integrity. And that's not just technology investment, that's people. And going back to a couple of things that Vivian said, I totally agree that this is not just about technology solutions. Technology solutions are only as good as the people who are able to use those. And actually, in the end, we believe very firmly that decisions around research integrity, editorial decisions, need to be made by humans. And technology are a tool. That's all they are. They're a tool to support that. And so there's been investment both in people. Well, certainly we've made that, and there's investment in technology. I think in the same way that there has been growth in these things over a period of time, I'm sure that will continue. There is a pace of change there. How much, I don't know. But to the point of, it's not just about generative AI, it's investment in lots of different parts of the research system that are required to solve this issue. And I go back to the point of, again, on the one hand, there is a challenge with fraudulent papers, but it's also how do we support some of the positive initiatives that actually support openness in research and transparency, that aids reproducibility, that raises the bar overall, which makes it more obvious when there's fraudulent papers. So how do we support things like data sharing, for example? How do we provide those sort of investments, which I know many publishers are working on? And it's those pieces as well that are required, I think, to address these challenges.
Yeah, so probably, and then I'd like to open for questions and for conversation, but I think this is probably which we didn't really reflect on yet as an industry, that this is truly digitization, right? It's not putting a book or a journal on a server and basically have whatever kinds of types of files there and consumption and distribution there. But I think now we are probably in a part of, or in a set of problems that almost every digital business has, because it's about authenticity, identity, and all those other things that we spoke about. I guess researcher identity is one of those topics that will probably be more specifically on the agenda in research integrity and publishing integrity in the next years. So, questions. Here's the first one.
Okay, good morning. My name is Rudolf Sauer. I'm here for the journal Deutsche Geschichte. And some weeks ago, I read an article that Mr. Noam Chomsky, he said, AI may produce predictions and descriptions, but never explanations. So I think AI is overestimated and overrated.
Peter, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think, so the big change that's happened in AI over the last year is that prior to the availability of generative AI models, the primary AI paradigm was machine learning. And the way that machine learning works is it takes a lot of data in, and there are very constrained ways of producing outputs. So in that model, where you're throwing an earlier generation of AI, a whole bunch of text, or a whole bunch of images, or a whole bunch of audio, and you're training that generation of AI to come out with a certain type of understanding. You're basically telling it, it can be A, B, or C, help me understand what it is. And that kind of model is predictive, underlying, based on the patterns of data that it observes. What's different about the newer wave of conversational interfaces and the underlying models that represent them, which are generative AI models, is that they have access to a wide range of data, and because there's been a change in how their ability to compute outputs has changed, the math underlying that has undergone a significant change in how those models are constructed. And as a consequence of that, generative AI models can yield outputs that are synthetic across a wider range of inputs than has been the case before. So they are generative, truly. They are able of creating novel synthesis across information in a predictive manner, right? So they will say A and B often are found together, and you're asking a question about this, and so I can show you what this connection is. The AI can show you what that connection is, and what some of the consequences of it might be based on its understanding of the context of knowledge that AIs have been trained on. So this is a very different way of building new understanding of our world. It's a tool that we have made, but it's also, in many ways for the first time, a creative one not in terms of fallacy or storytelling only, but a way of producing new ways of drawing out insights from the knowledge we've already generated and shared with each other to allow us to penetrate scientific darkness in ways that we didn't have before. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge both the weaknesses but also the really fundamental opportunities that these newer models of AI can provide us as a community.
Thanks for taking that. Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather Staines from Delta Think, and thanks for a great session. I'm moving away from AI for just a moment. We've done some projects on research integrity, talking to publishers and talking to institutions, and what we found, and I've mentioned this in other conferences, so forgive me if it's repetitive to anyone, that the things the publishers are concerned about in terms of research integrity are at an entirely different level than what the institutions are concerned about. Publishers are concerned about image manipulation, fraud, paper mills, and the like, and the universities are concerned about scandals and being defunded and not getting faculty or students to come. And I was talking to a publisher about this yesterday, and they said, yeah, we've given up entirely on trying to get the institutions involved in fixing this. And my first thought was, oh, okay, maybe something will happen. But you spoke, Vivian, about the pressure involved. We've talked about, the processes and economies of scale. It seems to me like we can't leave the institutions out of this and hope to come to a satisfactory resolution. So I'd just love to hear your feedback on that.
May I take that first of all? I 100% agree with you. I think it's incredibly important that we have a dialogue between publishers and institutions around some of these issues. You're right. On one level, the scientific publishers' primary concern is the establishment of the scholarly record. Is it right? Is it not? Can we build on it? Can we not? But there are people involved, and we mustn't forget the people. How we handle cases of research integrity have profound impacts on people. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes there's malintent, sometimes there isn't malintent. And that requires a really careful and sensitive dialogue with people who are involved in these situations. And I can only speak for Elsevier, but we endeavour to make sure that we do have that dialogue rather than working just in complete isolation.
So, I guess I pushed back on Heather's representation of institutions a little bit, and and like I intimated earlier, there are a wide range of different kinds of institutions with a wide range of different kinds of concerns. But I think, again, speaking from the environment in which I'm working, which are maybe the upper tier of research universities, we are very much engaged and want to be partners with the apparatus that records and is engaged with our faculty, our researchers, our scientists on the production of knowledge and how it's shared. And that's really critical for us. I think it's been somewhat both stereotypical but partially true that the contestation over open access and the wave of generation of different kinds of economic models and access models that we've struggled through as a broader community over the last 10 years has sometimes created or exacerbated the perception of conflict between universities and publishers, particularly larger ones that are not just providing society-based journals, but also providing platform services and beginning to enter markets for around understanding or analyzing research outputs within the broader academic context. Because publishing is not just publishing, it really is understanding the greater field of researcher output and trying to provide insights across that. And that's something that institutions are themselves really aligned with. And so I think in part this is why I'm here as a library representative, but also one deeply invested in the success of publishing's journey, is that the dialogue between sort of the production and then the publication or the dissemination and the discovery, which are critical aspects of what publishing provides and publishing platforms provides. It's really part of one fabric. And I think the more opportunities we have to invest in the kind of shared infrastructures that Stuart alluded to earlier in terms of creating methods of creating federated data deposit or creating standards that can be utilized across the entire flow of research, these are critical elements, and they bring us together, working together on these standards, on these ways of understanding, on citation. It brings us all together, and so it's really critical for us to support. And Sven, you mentioned sort of the world of startups. Sometimes startups are sort of the cutting edge of how we can see new ways of building these worlds, building this kind of communication across the very different kinds of publishing that we represent here, and all to their greater glory. We all need to support a very rich and robust means of exploring new ways of uniting this enterprise together.
Before you answer the question or add your elements to the answer, maybe I can add a part to the question, Heather. How about your editorial boards, editors-in-chief, and so on in this whole equation? Do they worry? Do they mind? Is it an issue for them? Is it a publisher's issue? Is it their issue? Is it the institution's issue? How do you see it?
I mean, I think it's a shared issue, and I think it's really important. I mean, this came up a number of years ago. There was a feminist philosophy journal that had a huge scandal around how a certain paper was reviewed and published. And I think there was then a workshop that came out of that, and it talked about the importance of journals, editors, and publishers to come together. And in this workshop, sort of journal editors got together and talked about their concerns, and publishers got together and talked about their concerns. And I think the outcome of that was the need for journal editors, when they're out of their depth, or to know that they can go to their publisher and be supported by their publisher, and for their publishers not to abandon their editors and say, oh, it's your problem. I think it becomes a combined problem and a problem we need to solve together, because otherwise it can only unravel and become worse. So I think it really, again, they are concerned, and I think they're concerned because they are also out of their depth with dealing with this. I mean, even now with open access, Creative Commons licenses, I mean, these are all highly complex sort of shifts that are happening, and sort of skills and expectations placed on journal editors who are already overburdened with a range of issues that they have to deal with. So I think it sort of only adds to that and underlines the importance of publishers to work with them and really give them the support they need. And obviously, their trust and relationships come into play there. So, yeah, and I think just to Heather's point, I do think there is a real issue, obviously, in the social sciences and humanities. I mean, institutions are abandoning entire disciplines and shutting down departments, at least in the humanities, full scale. So I think there is quite an alarming shift away and sort of responsibility of institutions to problems that they are themselves also creating through these pressures for academics to perform a range of admin tasks now that they didn't have to before because they don't have the support staff in the department. So, and these then add to those further pressures for academics and researchers who then have to be the interim dean alongside publishing, alongside being a journal editor. So these all add to a kind of a range of issues that I think, are much bigger than us as well.
Yeah, thanks. There's one question in the back of the room, or comment.
Thank you. It's more kind of a point for general reflection, and I think it's really interesting what you've just mentioned, because my comment will be aligned to those lines. So I think the three speakers have all touched upon the importance of researchers as kind of also the trust actors. So peer review is still of key importance to validate research. So, and as we see kind of more kind of possibilities with generative AI and others to generate content for peer reviews as well, how do you see kind of the research community evolving in terms of their roles as peer reviewers, as journal editors? So in publishing 10 years ago, a big issue was around getting credit for peer review, right? So there was Publons and other platforms that were created. Policymakers started to kind of also acknowledge peer review contributions, so they started acknowledging whenever a researcher had done peer review in their grant applications, but it's still free labor, right? There is a moral code that if I review your paper, I will trust that my colleague will review it as well in a rigorous manner. So as kind of their role also shifts in this direction, I wonder if the panel would have any insights on how we may see kind of their behaviors around accepting to review, performing reviews, and demanding to be recognized financially for their contributions might change as well. Thank you.
Stuart, why don't we start with you on this?
Good question. I think from a reviewer perspective, I think the responsibility is how is the role changing for reviewers? We've talked about the volume of articles. We talk about the pressure on the system and the need for reviewers. We talked about also these challenges of research integrity and the pressures that puts on the system. And therefore, reviewers editors, authors, everybody in the system has a role to play in helping to continue to ensure the scholarly record is robust. From a publisher point of view, I think the key is to make sure that we give the support that we can to the reviewers. So if the job is becoming more difficult, how can we enable with tools ways in which we can help reviewers over time to make their roles easier? The same for editors as well. I'm sure there are pieces around credit, and there are different systems for that. But at the moment, my focus is how do we help reviewers? How do we give the tools? How do we give the guidelines? How do we help in that? If I take a step back on the generative AI question at the moment, just to clarify, one of the things I think all publishers have been grappling with is what are our rules, what are our policies about generative AI, how can you use it at the moment? Many publishers, there's some differences in policies, but today, certainly at Elsevier, and I think for many publishers, the approach to this point has been that authors can use generative AI to some extent for language editing, for language improvement, to the extent that they disclose that. For editors and reviewers, it's more difficult because putting it into a generalized open LLM to help them maybe do their task, then there are issues around IP, around privacy, etc., etc. And so for most publishers, that's been not allowed. And so the challenge is, how do we as publishers provide bespoke tools or private tools that can enable that sort of help to reviewers and indeed editors? And I think that's the direction of travel that we'll see over the next few months.
I mean, I think if I could add, I don't. For me, I think what goes on when peer reviewers, I think, very rightly say, "Why am I giving my free labor to a journal who's published by a large corporate publisher making huge profits?" I think, there's a fundamental issue there around what are we publishing and where is publishing going, or has it gone, around sort of what is the purpose of publishing. And I think, as it becomes a high margin profit center for many publishers, I think it becomes then less about the end results of research outputs. And I think academics are painfully aware of that. Also, we talk about copyright and how their own work is controlled, and even controls how they themselves can use their own work. I think there are many sort of perversions of how scholarly publishing functions these days, and authors bear the brunt of that. And I think they are also the peer reviewers, so they're also very wrapped up. I mean, these aren't isolated functions and roles, right? They are, your peer reviewer is also your author, is also your contributor, is your journal editor. So they're part of the whole ecosystem. So I think what we're hearing and the pushback we have from peer reviewers is just ultimately about the larger kind of discontents with where publishing is going and why they are contributing to this publishing ecosystem. And I think I feel like we need to address that rather than, it's not about we need to help peer reviewers be more efficient in peer reviewing. I mean, I think peer reviewers are really sort of using this as a statement. And in the turn, I mean, I think there have been conversations that peer reviewers can then therefore make a political statement about who they review for and how. And it's hard to get peer reviewers. They are overburdened. So they have to be extra selective about who they review for. And we've definitely had this feedback. So for our journals where we have subscribed to Open, which our academics have really given us some great feedback to say that this is an important, equitable model. So yes, I wouldn't have peer reviewed for you if you were publishing in some other way. If you were a gold APC journal, I wouldn't peer review for you, but because I support this model, I will do it. And I think that's a very strong statement around how academics feel they should be contributing to the larger ecosystem.
I was a little bit concerned that we would all agree on everything and this whole panel wouldn't get a little bit of an edge. Now it did, thanks Vivian. And it's time for us to wrap up because Leah has the next interesting panel up here. I would like to thank you all, Vivian, Peter and Stuart, for coming out today, for having this great conversation. Thanking all you for being here today. And I guess this was an exercise and an experiment that we should probably repeat next year, but that's up to you, Leah. Over to you.
Thank you.